So I know the last time we made a video about this subject, it went over very, very well. And when I say last time, I mean yesterday. Because yeah, we had talked about Sidney Crosby and the conversation as to whether or not he will sign or whether or not he won't sign, and how there hasn't been a contract extension handed out to Sid the Kid just yet, which leaves the door open for interpretation of the otherwise. Still though, if I were to hedge my bets, I'd say it's probably a lot more likely that Sid the Kid does stay in Pittsburgh, but you can never be too sure with these things, especially when the contracts are not officially signed yet. However, in this video, we're going over yet another idea relating to Sidney Crosby and what one Bryan Hayes said about the situation on TSN Hockey. Time for a change. From Bryan Hayes and Frank Corrado, is Sidney Crosby better off leaving the Pittsburgh Penguins? I'll leave a link in the description to the article wherein this post was mentioned, because the article that we're going to be looking at on hockeylatest.com has the quote from Bryan Hayes written out, so it's easy for us to follow along. But this right here is what Bryan Hayes says on the show. If Sidney Crosby is going to wait it out, play his final year, and hit free agency next year, then he should sign with the Toronto Maple Leafs. It doesn't get bigger than that in the hockey world. Maybe the greatest Canadian captain of all time, or real close to it, with Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier, and Mario Lemieux. One of the great winners of all time. Golden goal in 2010, come home, come to Canada, end the Canadian Cup drought as a Maple Leaf, John Tavares leaves, Sid comes in, it works out for everybody. And of course, this article, this video clip, this YouTube video that I'm talking in right now, it's going to be met with some huge criticism and a lot of people bouncing up and saying, okay, wait a minute, calm down. Calm your horses, saddle them back up, rein them back into the barn, because this is not going to happen. Sidney Crosby is not coming over to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Ay, this was talked about on TV? Why? The Sports Network, right? Going out there and making everything about the gosh darn Toronto Maple Leafs. Go figure. But what if we had this conversation that said that it could happen? What if Sid the Kid heads into 2024-2025 with the Pittsburgh Penguins, they don't sign a contract extension at any point throughout this calendar season, and then Crosby has yet another great year? We already saw the comments from the agent the other day saying that, of course, the preference would be for Sidney Crosby to still be able to win and be a part of a competitive organization, but there already are some concerns as to whether or not the Penguins could fulfill that. So if you decide that Pittsburgh is not that destination, if he decides to go to free agency, is Toronto much of an upgrade in that regard? Honestly, you could say that Toronto is like Pittsburgh, circumstantially just a little bit younger, because what are the two problems that plague both of these fan bases and their teams right now? They've got a lot of money tied up in a lot of guys. A few guys are making most of the money on these two teams. It's just, with Toronto, you've got Tavares, Nylander, Marner, Matthews in an age range that's a little bit younger than that of Crosby, Malkin, Karlsson, and Letang. Similar problems, different timelines. So if you wanted to say, okay, for Toronto, if Tavares ends up leaving, they don't re-sign him, or they re-sign him but it's extremely cheap, it's like $3 million a year or whatever. If they've got extra money to burn for yet another veteran guy who could make some significant contributions to the team's center core, is Sidney Crosby him? Now, just to paint a picture as to how everything could work, I'd say that Sidney Crosby would automatically be the most impactful player outside of Austin Matthews on the Toronto Maple Leafs should he just be cut and pasted onto this team. He is so good everywhere on the ice. He is the best grinder the NHL has ever seen. A perfectly calibrated and well-tuned surgeon on the ice who could find the tightest of gaps and make the niftiest of plays. He can win board battles, he can play defensively, and he can score a hell of a lot of points on top of that. Sidney Crosby is a generational talent, and he is still playing like a guy who, at 35, 36 years old, is still deserving of that generational label. He may not be one of the top 3 centers in the NHL anymore, but he still is very much in the top 5, you could say. So, adding on a guy like this to the Toronto Maple Leafs alongside of Austin Matthews gives yourselves a Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl-like 1-2 down the middle. It would be the second best center pairing in the NHL behind McDavid and Draisaitl. Matthews and Crosby could light the lamp in a variety of ways, and of course the way they would play and complement each other off on the power play would be amazing to watch as well. Pretty much everything John Tavares can do, Sidney Crosby can do better, and he's a lot faster, and I'd say he's more nimbler, and I'd say that he's more versatile than Johnny T. So if there is an opportunity to do this, and you get him at, let's say, $11 million a year, whatever, then I'd say it's a pretty reasonable addition to make, especially if you're trying to force the Toronto Maple Leafs to get past the first round and into the second round. Plus, it would be a nice little stopgap if you're not fully believing that Auston Matthews should be the captain of this team just yet. Let Tavares go. Get Sidney Crosby, give him the captaincy for a year or two, and then when he rides off into the sunset, you'll give Auston Matthews to see, maybe even with a Stanley Cup ring already on his finger. Who really knows? But of course, though, this is all just one hypothetical that was talked about by one guy on TSN on one video. If you go over to the replies, I mean, it's super all over the place. A lot of people going out there saying, okay, well, Crosby is not going to leave Pittsburgh. There's no way that he decides to go to Toronto. If he does leave, it would probably be Colorado or Montreal. There are a lot of connections that you can make to various teams. Honestly, the Toronto one doesn't really make much sense if you're trying to project it anywhere else other than, oh, Bryan Hayes on TSN said it. That's why we're talking about it here. But because we have talked about Crosby and all the other teams, we had talked about the Nathan MacKinnon connection, we had talked about his father's connection to the Montreal Canadiens, there, of course, are reasons to illustrate different Crosby scenarios. Toronto just happens to have one dude on TV who talked about it, which is why we're making this video here on YouTube. But if you're a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. How do you feel about the idea of Sidney Crosby leaving the Penguins to join your team? Is this an idea that makes sense? Is this one that you would prefer to see happen? Do you think the odds of this happening are higher than the odds of him going to a Colorado team or a Montreal team? What do you think the odds are that he just up and away stays in Pittsburgh and Kyle Dubas gets this entire thing done? I'm recording this video on the night of Saturday, July 6th, so by the time this is up on YouTube, there may actually be a Crosby extension. Who really knows? We had talked about this in the video yesterday, but yeah, the one time we talk about Crosby, oh, it's very well possible he could go out there and sign that extension, a la Duncan Keith when he got traded to the Oilers. But either way, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Penguins fans, how much does this enrage you to see your captain be tossed into all of these different discussions? Oh, he could be a piece targeted by the Maple Leafs. He could go to Colorado. Now TSN folks are talking about him replacing John Tavares. And furthermore, if you end up losing out on Sidney Crosby, what happens to the rest of your team? Do you lose out on him for nothing? You play out the entire season, or do you force him to get traded? There are other conversations you can have about Crosby and the way his departure from Pittsburgh may transpire, but for now, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. How do you feel about Sid the Kid and the potential of him becoming a Maple Leaf? I hope you enjoyed this video, 99, and bye.